Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. It's my real pleasure to host you all today here in our new premises. I'm really happy to greet today one of the persons which I deeply admire in her work, della Porta, who is coming from Scuola Normale Superiore from Florence. Donatella della Porta is one of the persons that is inevitable when you are dealing with social engagement, and especially when you mention social movements, that is the name which always appears on the top of this field when you think of the scholars, but also wider. I will present briefly her professional background. She's professor of political science, dean of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, and director of the PhD program in political science and sociology at Scuola Normale Superiore. I have a problem with pronouncing that. Yes, but she also leads a center which has really nice name. It's called Cosmos, that is Center on Social Movement Studies, obviously. And among the main topics of her research, besides social movements, she's dealing with political violence, with terrorism, corruption, the police, and protest policing. She has also been very successful in European Research Council grants. So she won one ERTZ project, which was called Mobilizing for Democracy, and it dealt with civil society participation in democratization processes in Europe, Middle East, Asia, and Latin America, so one really global perspective. In 2011, she was recipient of Matej Dogan Prize for distinguished achievements in political sociology. And she's also honorary doctor of the University of Lausanne, Bucharest, and Gothenburg. Hopefully that won't be the end. She became a prolific writer, I could say, whose writing had a profound effect and impact on studies of social movement and wider. She's author of 85 books, really congratulations on that, 130 journal articles, and 127 contributions in edited volumes. Among her very recent publication, there is the book which we will discuss today afternoon. That is the book Where Did the Revolution Go?, which was published in 2016, and the most recent books are Movement Parties in Time of Austerity and Late Neoliberalism and Its Discontent, which were published last year, and probably we are expecting more this year. So without further ado, I would thank you for coming to Belgrade, accepting an invitation, and I will give you the floor for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Gazela, for this very kind presentation and for the invitation in this beautiful building and in this beautiful city. When I was thinking about what I could present, moving beyond resistance, I in fact thought to use some illustrations from this book that Gazela mentioned, which is called Movement Parties in Times of Austerities, and which focuses on the ways in which, especially in the European context, new political parties have emerged from a wave of protest that was very much critical of established politics, so which surprised us as social movement scholars, because it was at the same time very critical of the existing politics, but also very quick in entering institutions. So maybe rather than moving beyond resistance, these parties wanted to bring resistance inside the institutions. And this is one of the books I took inspiration from today, for today's presentation. because there are other two which maybe I will not present directly, but I touch upon in the discussion. And one is a book that we, with some colleagues, published on what we called referendums from below. Because what austerity policies did was to trigger a type of reactions in electoral politics in both ways. In terms of emerging parties, we discussed yesterday also emerging parties at the local level, but also at the national level, and referendums and pseudo-referendums like one we had in Italy, very successful, on against water privatization of water supply, but also the referendums in Scotland and the referendums in para-referendums in Catalonia are examples of referendums which are not driven by the elite, but with a lot of participation from below. And the final book, not yet published, not yet completely written, is on crowdsourced constitutional processes, because I think another ways of entering institutions by social movements which have emerged, especially against austerity policies, have been through attempting at rewriting constitutional rules. Iceland is an example, but there are many others, and I think this brings in also a perspective about how to move beyond resistance, or how to move resistance within institutions. So I will address especially one topic which has been considered for a long time a silence in two related fields of knowledge in political and social sciences: social movements on the one hand and political parties on the others. What had happened was that even though in the very beginning of the history of both fields of research, interactions between parties and mass politics or social movements had been relevant, but in more recent times, social movements had developed a model in which movements were considered to be at the gate of the political system. This is the title of a book by Sidney Tarrow, and the idea was movements are at the beginning of a process of producing issues which then enter the political system. There are gatekeepers. These gatekeepers are parties, so movements can mobilize attentions, transforming political parties, but not entering directly in the institutions. On the other side, party politics, research on political parties had been moved more and more by a sort of Downsianian model, a model which considered political parties as just entrepreneurs that were aiming at capturing voters as entrepreneurs in the market. So the idea was no longer ideological parties, no longer mass parties, parties which were transformed through new technologies and so on, and the interactions between the two was limited. Let's see if, yeah. So in these pictures of reciprocal lack of interest, I think that the new wave of protest, which started around 2008 with the crisis, with the arrival of the financial crisis in Europe, especially in Iceland, and then moved with the peak in 2011, prompted also some reflections about the ways in which social movements could mobilize and enter into institutions. So also prompted some reflections on the, say, limitations of the type of framework that we had used as social movement scholars and party scholars in order to address the issues. These protest waves against austerities was not immediately pushing us as scholars to think that these movements were going to enter institutions. It was a wave of protest which had mobilized against both center-left and center-right parties. One of the main slogans of the Indignados movement, the 15 de Mayo movement in Spain, was "La llaman democracia y no lo es." They call it democracy, but it is not. And the vicinity, the approaching of center-right and center-left parties in supporting austerity policies had been one of the main topics addressed by all these social movements. So there were movements that were very horizontal, not only critical of established political parties, but also critical of the social movement organizations that had been pivotal in previous wave of protest, like the global justice movement. There were movements that claimed that they had to mobilize those who had been affected by the crisis directly without going through mediations. There were also movements that tended to point at direct forms of democracy. The global justice movement had put forward appeals for participatory and deliberative democracies. These movements developed ideas about democracies in continuation with the global justice movement, but stressing more the direct representations of the people, and they were using also direct forms of actions, to a certain extent more disruptive than the social forums of the global justice movements. And so they were movements that have been described, especially immediately, as movements with anti-establishment type of frames. Some had said apolitical or anti-political outlook, but which in reality tended to politicize a lot the public opinion, the type of debate in the countries they developed the most. We have studied protest in all the European countries during austerity policies, but what we could notice that these movements were especially strong where austerity policies were more disruptive of everyday life, and the reactions was not apathy, was not anomie, but it was rather a very broad politizations of the debates. Countries like Iceland, Spain, and Greece have been the examples of cases in which these movements developed the most. What happened also was that, as all movements, also these movements mobilized in the streets, but then discovered that mobilizing in the street was not enough to put forward the claims of the affected by the crisis. And so, especially in the declining phases, while some other cycles of protest had produced radicalizations in terms of political violence, in this case instead very broad movements did produce effects in the electoral system, and very, how can I say, very fast, rapid effects. For other movements, like the environmental movements, it had taken a decade to enter into institutions with the Green parties. For the labor movement, it had taken decades, in plural, to enter institutions through socialist parties and communist parties. In this case, we had instead a very rapid, very quick entering into the electoral arenas. How to explain this? In party politics in party studies. There is a theory which I think it's very interesting to revisit, and it is Steinrocken's ideas that the political parties developed out of societal cleavages, even more out of conflicts, out of social and political conflicts, that then party politics helped to freeze into political parties, and yet single out 4 such cleavages: state versus church, center versus periphery, city versus countryside, and the main cleavage, the class cleavage, the capitalism versus labor. Then research had developed noticing that these cleavages had tended more or less to be pacified. So especially the ideas which developed in the 80s and the 90s was that with the development of welfare states and democratic capitalism, the class struggles had been institutionalized and weakened to a certain extent. Nowadays the debate changed, and it is a debate about revitalizations of some of these cleavages, not only the class cleavage, but for instance also the center-periphery cleavages, even with some forms of emerging nationalism of an inclusive type. But also debate emerged on our new cleavages emerging. So for instance, scholars like Hans-Peter Krisi talked about an demarcation integration cleavages affecting more, focusing more on issues of inclusiveness of citizenship. In social movements literature, there was also some hint about the relevance of political parties for social movements. Parties had been considered especially as allies of movements, and this was true especially of left-wing parties, and this was true even with tensions between left-wing parties and progressive social movements. But scholarship in social movement studies said this was true especially when the left was in oppositions, less so when the left was in power, when the left was divided rather than when it was unified, because there was more interest by political parties on the left to capture new type of constituencies, and when it was more class-based. So typically it was more the cases with the communist parties in Southern Europe than with the more moderate party in Central Europe. But even up to the global justice movement, these examples of some type of alliances had remained there in the provision of logistics help, in some forms of overlapping membership, in some members of political parties that showed some interest in finding new constituencies within social movements themselves. So parties had been considered as allies, but an observation which was made starting with Latin America was that, especially for political parties on the left, a main turning point, a critical juncture in an institutional type of language, was the support that neoliberalism got on the center left. Ken Roberts is a scholar of political parties in Latin America, who studied in particular the ways in which different constellations emerged in different countries in Latin America, exactly according to and following the decisions by center-left parties to support or not to support the type of austerity policies that had followed the crisis earlier on in Latin America than in Europe. So he suggested that new parties like MAS in Bolivia, but also new leaders in Venezuela or Ecuador, were following the disappointment, frustration, outrage of former constituencies of the left, faced to what they considered to be a betrayal. So this alliance is what, say, challenged. Other ideas in social movement literatures was that some movement parties had emerged from protest and from social movements. So typically the Greens had a story of development from within environmental movement, even if they did not represent those movements. They had the constituencies that had been mobilized around these issues. And then also, and this is an idea which I also think is useful to develop, protest has transformed very often existing parties. So if you take historical works on the traditional labor parties, socialist parties, communist parties, what emerged was that movements were not only important in the beginning, in the initial development of these parties, but also that each big wave of protest introduced seeds of critique inside the parties and transformation. So typically the story of Labour Party in the UK is very much affected by the pushing of social movements during wave of protest. So putting together this type of insights, we at the Cosmos, at the Center on Social Movement Studies, thought that it was time to start to mobilize this knowledge in order to try to understand, as I mentioned, phenomenon which we had not predicted. I remember I had been invited in Spain in 2012 and was asked, do you think as a social movement scholars that a party will emerge from this big protest? And I said, sociologists do not make predictions, but I don't think so. And instead there was Podemos which emerged. So it was something that we didn't predict because very often existing toolkits, conceptual toolkits, are not sufficient to understand innovative forms of politics and social protest. But we thought that type of transformations in electoral politics, which were very dramatic in all the countries affected, and which in some cases produced parties which emerged from the development of the protests themselves, required reflections on this hybrid type of actors, hybrid in the sense that it was moving and interacting within at least two different type of fields. Social movements on the one hand, protest cycles were still ongoing, and party politics on the others. And defining these parties as an ideal type. None of these parties meets all the type of conceptual definitional elements. But if we want to build an ideal type able to help us understanding these parties, I think that one could work with three main concepts developed in social movement studies, which are the concepts of organizational structures, so mobilizing of resources, frames analysis, and analysis of repertoires of protest. And on all these elements, these movement parties were, say, bridging, putting in contact parties and social movements. So at the level of the repertoires of actions, these political parties were often in the street, to the extent that a party like Syriza was criticized for having, say, taken attention away in the politics of the squares from the movements, orienting it into electoral politics. At the same time, they were parties that, from the organizational point of view, introduced a lot of changes in what political party scholars call the linkages, internal and external type of linkages of these parties, opening up forms of participations by movement activists, even if they were not formally part of the parties. And third, in terms of claims, these political parties referred very much to the claims of the social movements that protested against austerities, and some ideas like the ideas of the commons, not only the struggles against privatizations, but also putting forward concrete proposals in terms of constitutional transformations, was also something that these parties took from the movements and bring in into electoral policies. So what can we say about conditions under which these parties emerged? We have to consider that we want to explain, when thinking about these parties, three things at the same time. Why these parties emerged, but also why were them so successful. That parties emerged from a wave of protest is not so unusual. We had it in the 70s after student protest in many European countries. We had it after several waves of protest. But what was typical of these parties was that they emerged and immediately broke in the electoral politics, either entering government like Syriza did, or going very near to it, entering important institutions at the local level, as Podemos did. The Five Stars movement is another of the parties we consider in the book. And also there, it was extraordinary and extraordinary quick degree of success. And this is not normal, because very often social movements are very strong in the streets, but quite weak in electoral politics. So this is the second thing, why they became successful, and why those parties exactly. Because if you take the countries in which these parties emerge, I can include also Iceland with the specific developments in the pirate parties and on the left. In all these cases, there were many parties, so other parties which had emerged. But it was Syriza, it was Podemos, it was the Five Stars movement that became very successful. And this is another specific questions I think we have to address. So what we found in literature, for instance, Herbert Kichelt is one of the few scholars who have been developing ideas at the border between social movements and party politics, is that new parties tend to emerge when collective interests are intensively held. So the protest in 2011, especially in the countries I mentioned, were peculiar, not only because they were addressing again sort of material issues, class issues, in a world which had been described as moving away from these issues, but they were also peculiar in terms of their capacity to to get majority support. So social movements have often been described as actors of minorities. They produce new ideas. But Indignados in Spain and in Greece got the sympathies of a very broad sector of the populations. Opinion polls said of broad majorities of the populations. So this was true, and this is true also in other countries where issues of social justice re-entered the debate very strongly during this wave of protest. But there is a second point which Kitchell stresses, and we also found illuminating, is established parties make no effort to embrace such interest. So social movements and movement parties are interacting within a party system in which other actors are there, and the insiders always have more resources to mobilize. But they could challenge successfully the establishment because the establishment didn't support, didn't take up those claims. In fact, it was a different story where some of the center-left parties did take up claims by the movements, as it was, for instance, the case in Portugal, where we have now a party, a government which comes from the alliances of a party that to a certain extent is a movement party, Bloc de Izquierda, the left-wing bloc, but also the traditional center-left socialist party in Portugal. Third point, and I think this is relevant also, is that electoral systems are designed in order to include and exclude. And they put different thresholds to entrance from the point of view of who can present list to the transformations of votes into power within political institutions with changes. And in fact, it is true that these parties had to, I will say it later, to exploit some potential possibilities within some of these party systems. So declining competition with other parties was certainly relevant. And here there is a lot of research on political parties which says that not only the time of mass ideological parties about which Max Weber and others had talked a lot is over, but also that there is a general quick and strong decline of trust and confidence in those parties which had been allied to social movements in particular, in all parties in general, but the crisis is especially a crisis of the center-left parties. And what is to be considered is that this crisis was not only visible where the austerity policies hit most, but it is also visible in countries like the Netherlands, Austria, and more recently Germany, in which social democratic parties, socialist parties seems to have an easier life in addressing the, say, relatively minor effects of the crisis. But also there, while in party politics, in the years 2000, it was the radical left which was considered to be as challenged, as declining, as the sick child of the left. Nowadays, it is more the center-left parties that are looking for ways to exit a very significant type of crisis. And I think one of the elements in this development is the problems that neoliberalism brought about for these parties in particular, but more in general for a political system, in jeopardizing the capacity of the states to defend citizenship rights, which is something upon which democracies legitimize themselves and politics itself legitimized itself. So you tell me when I have just 5 minutes. 7 more minutes. So it's time for a big pictures, and what I try to summarize here is the discussions about how transformations of cleavages, so the emergence, re-emergence of old cleavages or emergence of new cleavages is translated or produces movement parties, that was to be reversed, through transformations which I mentioned in the party arenas and in the movement arenas. So on the party systems, the type of crisis that I described, which affected especially center-left parties, and on the movement arenas, large mobilizations on non-represented issues in declining stages of cycles of protest. So I think that's for the activists who founded these parties, and they were sometimes scholars, academics, like it happened with Podemos. The idea was, let's try what happens in an almost hydraulic type of fashion when on the left you see broad discontent by voters, and it seems that there is a space for new formation to emerge. So it was not a choice of the movements in their entirety. It was a choice by some of the activists who justified their choices also on the basis of the type of constituencies that they were mobilized. So we talk with activists in Spain or in Greece, and their argument was, when you have to do with a group of reference which is suffering a lot in terms of losing every point of reference in their life, losing the home, losing their job, losing their health insurance, losing their life. Goran Tebon wrote a book, The Killing Fields of Inequalities, in which he shows also how increasing inequality is really killing people, producing in the statistics the effects of reducing the expectations of life, increasing a lot of bad signal of development of their societies. So there was this attempt by party activists, and I skip this and I go to causal mechanisms. And one of the things we tried to add in this debate on the emergence of party policies is attention to relations and to long-term processes. So some parties, I said, failed. Some parties succeeded in developing parties which got much support up to entering into institutions. If we want to understand how it happened, I think we need to follow the different steps from the birth of these parties into the ways in which they started to become successful challengers towards established parties. And in social movement studies, there has been a push to go beyond sort of deterministic causation, so there are causes and then effects, and trying to analyze the arrows, the causal mechanism. How did it happen that the dissatisfactions with the center-left party translated into alternative challenges in electoral politics? And these causal mechanisms, I think, can be described when we look, we looked in parallel at the stories of these parties. And one element was the perceptions that it was possible to enter inside institutions, that there was a gap, that there was an empty spot to be occupied. So the slogan of occupying developed also within the electoral system, and it was a slogan which was filled by the perceptions that there was some space for this. But also these perceptions then were, can I say, proved right in some first elections, which were sort of attempts. It was local elections for the Five Stars movement. It was European elections for Podemos because of the different electoral system for the European and the national elections in Spain. And these activists who had to a certain extent also been involved into party politics before through forms of overlapping membership, succeeded in developing a causal mechanism which I define as galvanization. So first victories tended to push the attentions of activists and the public opinion towards some specific collective actors. Podemos and Syriza Five Stars movement are example of this. And what happened was that these galvanizations also brought about what I call the reverse reputational effects of blamed. So these parties were blamed by the center-right parties, by the center-left parties were considered as their main enemies. They were blamed by the media, which suddenly converged in attacking what they defined as populist, anti-politics, and so on. But they were blamed by actors that were so stigmatized in the public opinion that being blamed by them became a sort of push forward in the public opinion. So the process was relevant in terms of step-by-step consolidating these movement parties as important, can I say, challengers, and also consolidating the attention on the left side. There were challenges, so of course none of these parties would be accepted as representative of the movement. Syriza in power could not do what Tsipras had promised. Podemos has difficulties in addressing different political context in different Spanish regions and the Catalonia, and with the successful examples of En Común in power, which is linked to Podemos, but say adapted to the Catalan context, as there were difficulties in dealing with the issues of independence of Catalonia. The search for a new type of organizational structures is still very open. The pros and cons of the introductions of new technologies are often discussed. And electoral politics is an arena in which other actors are there and they reacted. And so, for instance, for several of these parties, one of the challenge is if they really want to move to power, to develop alliances politics that are not so easy to develop. Final 3 minutes on then what type of expectations we can have in thinking about in which directions these movements are going. I think in party politics studies there is an attempt to make typologies about main forms of political parties. So there was an initial moment in which ideological cadre parties were the most widespread forms of parties in the beginning, at the origins of democracies. There were class-based mass parties, which were considered as the winning ideas of the left in terms of public politics. There were cartel type of parties that developed later on, and nowadays there is what I call neoliberal populist parties on the left, or populist discourse, populist parties on the right, and the populist discourse on the right. I think that the protest parties tend to a certain extent to challenge, but to a certain extent also to adapt to the dominant type of parties. So they enter into a dialectic type of relationship with existing institutions, and I don't think that the transformations is already, how can I say, decided deterministically on the basis of an iron law, but I think that some of the characteristics of the party system cannot be ignored by these parties. In fact, what you have is a development in between fields. So parties tend to interact with social movements and to political parties. But there are also, final words, other types of transformations that I think are relevant as well in situations in which because of the competitions inside the party system, new parties have more difficulties in emerging. And I think that a phenomenon like the victory, totally unexpected and very disruptive in terms of pre-existing type of conceptions of the parties, of Corbyn in the Labour parties, and of the quite successful campaigns of Sanders within the Democratic parties in the United States testifies of alternative ways through which movements entered in parties. And as I mentioned, the forms of direct democracy in terms of multiplications of referendums, either promoted from above or from below, but participated from below, are also unexpected effects of social movements and of the attempt by movements leader to move beyond resistance or to move resistance within institutions. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.